When he died, they didn't invite me to the funeral. They said it would be better for everyone, that his family would handle everything themselves. I was his wife for 32 years. They erased me from the obituary, removed my name from the invitations, and didn't even let me say goodbye. But I had his letter. He wrote it a week before he passed. And I placed it in his casket, sealed in an envelope marked to be opened aloud. When the moment came, they couldn't stop him anymore, and he said everything himself. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Linda Holloway. I was 67 years old when my husband James passed away. For most of my adult life, I lived in a modest single-story home in a quiet suburb just outside of Minneapolis, Minnesota. It had a brick chimney, a wooden mailbox, and 2 oak trees that shaded the front yard like patient guardians. I had been a school librarian for nearly 30 years before retiring. I liked things that made sense: catalogs, soft voices, proper endings. I never raised my hand too quickly and never spoke louder than necessary. My marriage to James was the kind of life many people overlook because it isn't dramatic. We didn't fight loudly or love loudly. He was a physician, calm, methodical, always 5 minutes early to everything. Our routine was the unspoken thread that tied us together. Mornings began with him reading the paper while I prepared oatmeal. Evenings ended with us sitting side by side on the couch, each with a book, occasionally touching hands without needing to speak. There was a comfort in that silence, the kind of love that doesn't need explanation. We had no children together. He had 2 from his first marriage, adult children now, living in other cities, with their own families, their own chaos. They visited occasionally, mostly for holidays. They were always polite to me, at least outwardly, but I could feel the invisible line they had drawn. I wasn't their mother. I was Dad's second wife, an add-on, a shadow figure who came later in the narrative they believed they owned. James's family was large and rooted in tradition. Churchgoers, family photo takers, lovers of group texts, and Sunday potlucks. His sister Lynn called at least 3 times a week, and every conversation with her ended the same way. Advice I never asked for, and a reminder that family comes first. What she meant, though, was their family. I was always a courtesy, a footnote. Still, James never made me feel like I didn't belong, at least not intentionally. He held my hand in public. He introduced me as my wife without qualifiers. He remembered our anniversary without needing a calendar prompt. But he also didn't challenge his family when they left me out of things. He never corrected his daughter when she forgot to include me in family emails or when she mailed birthday invitations for the grandchildren to Dr. James Holloway, and not to both of us. He didn't say it aloud, but I think he thought it was easier that way. Less conflict, less friction. I let it go because I loved him, and because I knew he loved me, even if he sometimes chose silence over defense. The last few years of his life were quieter. After he retired, we traveled a little. Small trips, never far. He had health scares, nothing catastrophic at first, but enough to shift our rhythm. He became more tired. He smiled less. I began keeping medical records in a binder, organizing prescriptions by refill date, tracking his appointments with the same diligence I once reserved for shelving books. I turned into something between a wife and a nurse, though I never told him that. I just did it. Because that's what you do when you love someone who's slipping. There were moments when I sat by the window late at night and thought about what my life might be like when he was gone. Not out of morbidity, but because I knew that time was coming. I imagined a smaller world, a stiller house, a calendar with fewer marks. But what I never imagined, What I never thought to prepare for was what would happen when his family decided to erase me altogether. We had built something. Maybe it wasn't flashy or loud or photo-worthy. Maybe it didn't make it into scrapbooks or family speeches, but it was real. It was steady. It was ours. And I didn't know it yet, but they were about to pretend it never happened. The morning I found out James had died, I wasn't the first to know. Not even close. I had just finished folding laundry when my phone buzzed, not with a call from the hospital, but with a message from a former colleague of his. A short, cold sentence. "I'm so sorry for your loss." For a moment, I thought she had made a mistake. But then my hands began to tremble. I called the hospital. The nurse on duty sounded hesitant. After a long pause, she confirmed it. James had passed away in the early morning hours. He had been admitted 2 days earlier for complications related to his heart. No one had informed me. No one had even thought to call. I asked whether he had been alone. The nurse said that his daughter was with him. His daughter, not me. I hung up, slowly sat down on the edge of the bed, and stared at the dresser. His drawer was still slightly open from the night before. His watch sat where he always left it. His slippers were next to mine. His toothbrush was still wet. When I tried calling his daughter, she didn't pick up. When I tried his sister Lynn, the call went straight to voicemail. I left messages, short, measured, confused. I asked when the arrangements would be made. I asked whether they needed help. I asked when I should be there. Hours passed, no reply. Later that afternoon, I drove to his daughter's house. Her car was in the driveway. The blinds were drawn. When I rang the doorbell, no one answered. I stood there for several minutes. I knocked again. Nothing. The silence was louder than any words could have been. That evening, I checked social media. His daughter had posted a tribute already. A photograph of James from years ago, standing between his 2 children at some family picnic I hadn't been invited to. Her caption read, "He was everything to us. Our foundation, our heart. Rest easy, Dad." I read the comments. Dozens of condolences, people offering prayers, sharing memories. But no one mentioned me. I wasn't tagged. I wasn't named. I wasn't acknowledged. It was like watching myself disappear in real time. The next morning, I received a group email, not from his family, but from the church, a generic invitation to the funeral service. It had the time, the date, the address. At the bottom, it listed the family members who were graciously accepting condolences. His children, his sister, no mention of a wife, no mention of me. I refreshed the page 3 times, thinking maybe I had missed something. I hadn't. They were rewriting the ending, erasing me from the closing chapters of his life. They had always treated me like an outsider. But now, with James gone, they no longer felt the need to pretend. There was no more filter, no more tolerance. I had been tolerated only for his sake. Without him, they no longer had a reason to include me. It wasn't just personal. It was coordinated. They had removed my name from the obituary. They had excluded me from the private family service. They made all the decisions without me, about the casket, the flowers, the burial plot, the readings. It was as if I had never spent 32 years beside him, as if the dinners we shared, the holidays, the late-night drives to the ER, the years I spent waiting outside his office after long shifts, none of it counted. To them, I had never been part of the Holloway legacy. I was just the woman who lived in his house, a placeholder, a footnote, and yet the pain I felt wasn't loud. It didn't come in waves of tears or broken plates. It came like frost, slow, creeping, invisible to anyone but me. It covered everything I touched. I couldn't bring myself to change the sheets. I couldn't walk into the kitchen without imagining him reaching for the coffee. I couldn't open the medicine cabinet without seeing the tiny bottles lined up exactly how he liked them. But the worst part wasn't the grief, it was the erasure, because grief means you lost something. Erasure means it was never considered yours to begin with. They didn't need to say it to my face. Their silence was precise, intentional, and it worked for a while until I remembered the envelope, until I realized James had left something behind, not for them, but for me. It started with shortness of breath. At first, James dismissed it as nothing, a combination of humidity and age. But I noticed the way he paused at the top of the stairs, the way he reached for the wall after standing up too quickly, the way he stopped finishing his meals. He moved slower, not just physically, but with a kind of resignation that frightened me. He had always been careful with his health. As a retired physician, he kept track of every symptom, every odd pulse, every ache. But this time, he seemed almost reluctant to investigate it, as though he already knew, as though the answer had already settled inside his body and was quietly waiting. A week before his death, he asked me to sit down with him in the living room. It was early evening, and the light through the curtains made everything gold and soft, like the whole world had been muted. He looked pale, thinner than usual. His hands, once steady and capable, trembled slightly as he held a small envelope. He didn't explain. He didn't give a speech or offer a dramatic farewell. He simply handed it to me. The envelope was cream-colored, heavy, sealed with care. On the front, in his familiar handwriting, it said, "To be opened and read aloud, if I am gone." And beneath it, "Only at the church." I didn't ask questions. I nodded and placed the envelope in my desk drawer. I knew better than to press him. If he wanted to say more, he would, and if he didn't, I would wait. Over the next few days, I hovered, gently, quietly. I cooked his favorite meals, even when he barely touched them. I offered to drive him to the doctor, but he said he had already scheduled something. I didn't know then that he had reached out to his daughter instead, that he had, perhaps out of habit or guilt or weariness, given in to the comfort of old patterns. People always return to their roots when they sense the end. He spent most of his time in the den, reading the same book over and over, never marking his place. I found myself watching him more than speaking to him, memorizing the way he sat, the way his lips moved silently with each paragraph, the way he blinked slower than usual. His presence felt like a candle flickering at the very end of its wick, still there, still warm, but fragile. On the third night, I heard him cry in his sleep. It wasn't loud, just a soft exhale, a broken sound that didn't belong to the man I had known for 32 years. I wanted to reach for him. I wanted to wake him and say something that would make it better, but I didn't. I lay still and let him carry whatever burden had followed him into that dream. The following day, he packed a small overnight bag and said he needed to go see a specialist downtown. He said he'd only be gone a night or two. I offered to come. He declined gently, said he'd be fine, kissed my cheek, and then he left. He didn't come back. I waited for his call that evening. Then, the next morning, I assumed his phone had died or he was caught up with medical exams. But as the hours passed, a weight settled in my chest. I didn't want to panic. I told myself to be patient, that he was in capable hands, that he would reach out when he could. But he never did. The envelope sat undisturbed in my drawer. Every day I looked at it. I never opened it, not even a peek. It was the one thing he had asked me to do, and I wasn't going to betray that. I started writing down small details about him, afraid I might forget. The way he used to clear his throat before speaking, The way he would hum to himself while washing the dishes. The way he always folded his newspaper before reading it. I wanted to trap those memories before they evaporated. I thought we would have more time. We always think that. We believe in tidy endings, in final conversations wrapped in bows. But the truth is, endings rarely arrive with grace. They come in the form of a call you never received, an empty hallway, a message from someone who wasn't supposed to be the one to tell you, and all I had left was his envelope and a promise. The obituary was the first clear sign. I had read it 3 times, as if a fourth would suddenly make my name appear. It was published in the Sunday edition of the local paper, under a photo of James smiling from 20 years ago, his hair thicker, his face fuller, the kind of portrait people choose to remember rather than reflect reality. The article was short, formal, and precise. It mentioned his years of service as a physician, his volunteer work at the community health clinic, his love of fishing, and his devotion to his beloved children, his sister Lynn, and the extended Holloway family. That was it. No mention of a wife. No mention of 32 years of marriage. No mention of me. I read it again slowly. I held my finger to each line, mouthing the words aloud like they might change. But they didn't. The space where my name should have been was not even replaced. It was simply absent, as though it had never belonged. I stared at the phrase, survived by his family, for a long time. The implication rang clear. I was not considered part of that family, not even in death. That morning, I opened a drawer and pulled out every photograph I had of the two of us. Trips to Maine, anniversary dinners, Sunday mornings on the porch, smiling faces, linked hands, moments caught in time that now seemed suspended between truth and denial. I flipped through them one by one, not crying, not speaking, just absorbing. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't even sad. I was something colder, something quiet, the kind of quiet you find in museums or empty churches. I thought about all the dinners I had hosted where his children arrived late and left early, the birthdays where I wasn't in the group photos, the way his sister always introduced me as James's wife without using my actual name, how at every holiday I sat at the far end of the table while stories were exchanged over my head, stories from a life they never thought included me. But now they were no longer just distant. They had rewritten the ending. A few days later, I received a printed invitation to the funeral, a white envelope with black trim and a folded card inside. It was addressed to Linda Holloway, but the name had clearly been typed after the original print run. An afterthought. The message was curt, emotionless, a schedule rather than an invitation. A private family service will be held at St. Peter's Church, followed by a reception for family and close friends. I wasn't asked to speak. I wasn't asked to contribute to the program. There was no "in lieu of flowers" suggestion made in my name, no photo chosen from our life together. I called the funeral home. I asked who had made the arrangements. They told me it was handled by his daughter. I asked if my name had been submitted for the obituary. The woman on the line paused and said, "Not to my knowledge." I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat in the dark for a long time, watching the shadow of the afternoon move across the floor. Grief, I had come to learn, has layers. There's the raw wound of loss, and then there's the pain of watching your life with someone be edited out, footnote by footnote, until you're erased altogether. I remembered the envelope in my desk drawer, still sealed, still waiting. I pulled it out, placed it on the kitchen table, and just looked at it. His handwriting, now so final, the weight of it, the intention. He must have known. He must have known what they were capable of. He must have seen the way they excluded me, even when he was alive. He must have worried that if he wasn't there to name me, they would unname me. They would pretend I was temporary. That envelope felt heavier than it should have been, like it carried more than words, like it carried something sacred. That night, I prepared a simple meal. I lit a candle, not because it was special, but because I needed something warm, something intentional, something that reminded me of light. And then I packed a small purse. Inside it, I placed the envelope. I didn't know what it said. I didn't know how it would be received, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. If I couldn't speak at his funeral, he would. The morning of the funeral was overcast, as if the sky itself had decided to withdraw its warmth. I dressed slowly, deliberately, choosing a navy blue dress James had always said made me look elegantly grounded. I pinned my hair up, not for them, but for him. The envelope sat on my nightstand as I got ready, as if watching me, waiting. I placed it carefully into my purse, tucked between a handkerchief and my glasses case. I didn't add a single word to it. It was already complete. I arrived at the church early, but not first. His family was already inside, scattered near the altar, giving instructions to the ushers, adjusting programs, reviewing floral arrangements. I stayed near the back, quiet and uninvited, my presence acknowledged only with stiff glances and awkward avoidance. No one approached me. No one asked if I was all right. I saw Lynn near the front speaking with the priest. She looked composed in her tailored suit, her hair styled and shellacked into submission. She didn't look back at me once. James's daughter, Stephanie, stood beside the flower arrangement, flipping through a stack of papers, probably the printed order of service, the words they wanted to shape the memory of the man I had loved for half my life. I waited until the music began. The organ filled the chapel with soft, somber tones. People began taking their seats. I slipped past the crowd and made my way toward the side door that led to the sacristy. One of the attendants paused as if to stop me, but then thought better of it. Maybe it was the way I walked, or maybe it was the fact that I wasn't asking for permission. I found the priest alone, adjusting the white sash over his shoulders. He turned when he saw me. I introduced myself simply as James's wife. He looked surprised, perhaps not at my identity, but at the fact that I was there, in that moment, with such stillness. I handed him the envelope and told him that James had asked for this to be read aloud during the service. I didn't embellish. I didn't plead. I said it was his request, his words, not mine. The priest took the envelope and nodded. There was something in his expression, professional detachment softened by curiosity. He said he would honor James's wishes. I returned to my seat at the very back of the church. The service began. They read scripture, shared hymns. Stephanie spoke first. Her voice was calm, filled with practiced grief. She talked about his work ethic, his mentorship, his dedication to his children. Lynn followed, reading a passage about faith and family, about the strength of legacy. They praised him for the life he built. They thanked the people who supported him. But in all those words, I remained unnamed. The ceremony was nearly over when the priest stepped forward again. He cleared his throat and said that the deceased had left behind a personal letter with instructions that it be read aloud. There was a murmur, brief confusion, then silence. He opened the envelope and began to read. James's handwriting had always been neat, deliberate. His words mirrored that same precision. In the letter, he spoke directly, intimately. He described the last few years of his life as the most peaceful he had ever known. He said he owed that peace to the woman who had sat beside him every evening, who had held his hand through illness, who had reminded him that life was still worth savoring. He named me. He described the way I read to him when his eyesight began to fade, the way I arranged his medication, the way I knew when he needed space and when he needed presence. He said I had loved him with no expectation of recognition, but that I deserved it all the same. He ended the letter with a sentence that seemed to echo through every pew. If you're listening now and you ever wondered who truly stood by me at the end, it was Linda, my wife, my heart, my family. A stillness swept over the room. No one moved. No one looked at me, but they all heard him. It was the only voice that mattered in that moment. When the priest finished, he folded the paper and placed it gently back in the envelope. There was no applause, no dramatic gasps, just silence. A silence that carried weight. I stayed seated for the remainder of the ceremony, still and composed. I didn't seek their eyes. I didn't need to. James had said everything, and in doing so, he had given me something I never asked for, but needed more than I realized. Proof that our love had not been invisible. That envelope wasn't revenge. It was remembrance. It was dignity, returned in his voice, and it was his final gift to me. The sound of James's words echoed through the church long after the priest stopped reading. I sat in the last pew, completely still, feeling every syllable land like a stone dropped into deep, still water. I didn't look around. I didn't need to. I could feel the tension ripple through the room. I knew they were looking for something to anchor themselves, some way to dismiss what had just happened. But they couldn't, because it wasn't me who said it. It was him, and his voice could not be interrupted. Not this time, not now. All their carefully prepared tributes, his daughter's speech about legacy, his sister's talk of family tradition, now felt thin, paper thin, next to his handwritten truth. They had talked about blood, about birthright, about what they believed they meant to him, but he had spoken about presence, about who stood by him when the pain came, when the light dimmed, when the hours were slow and heavy. Me. His voice had never sounded louder than in that moment of absence. He had broken the order they'd worked so hard to construct. The version of his life where I was never quite real, never quite family, never quite enough. And the silence that followed was its own verdict. I didn't smile. I didn't smirk. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, heart steady, breath quiet. Around me, no one moved. I could feel the glances, brief, uncertain, then quickly averted. I didn't return them. I didn't offer acknowledgement. There are some moments that do not require a response. They complete themselves. When the service ended, people began to stand slowly, carefully, as if unsure how to behave. The usual swell of polite chatter never came. There were no embraces near the casket, no rush of people heading toward the family pews. It was as if the air itself had thickened, holding them in place. Stephanie turned briefly, her eyes scanning the rows. They didn't find me, or maybe they did, but she didn't stop. She turned back to the altar, her expression unreadable. Lynn was stiff, unmoving, her mouth slightly parted as if preparing to say something, and then deciding against it. The priest quietly folded the letter and returned it to the envelope. He looked down at it for a long moment, then glanced toward the back of the church, his eyes meeting mine for the briefest second. He nodded once, and I returned the gesture. I remained seated until the church emptied. No one approached me. No one tried to speak. I was invisible again, but this time, not erased. They couldn't rewrite what had been read aloud. They couldn't redact a man's final words. They couldn't remove the sentence where he called me his wife, his heart, his family. There was a kind of power in that. Not triumph, not vengeance. Something quieter, something more lasting. A reclaiming of space I had always held, whether they chose to see it or not. I walked down the aisle slowly, not as someone mourning, but as someone carrying something sacred, a truth sealed in paper and voice, a declaration that had been too heavy to say aloud while he was alive, but became unstoppable once he was gone. Outside, the wind had picked up. The trees bent slightly, whispering in their own language. I stood beneath them for a moment, closing my eyes. For years I had been spoken over, dismissed with polite condescension, kept at the edge of the circle, named only in passing, if at all. But today, James had pulled me to the center, and not one of them could speak over it. Not now, not ever. As I stood from the pew, the church was almost empty, but I didn't rush. I took my time walking down the center aisle, the echo of my steps soft against the stone floor. I kept my gaze forward, focused on the door, but I felt them, all of them. Their faces were carved into the silence. Lynn stood near the altar, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her jaw clenched. She wasn't looking at me, but past me, as if trying to hold on to the ceremony, the illusion, the version of events she had helped script. Her expression wasn't grief, it was something colder. The set of her mouth, the squint in her eyes. It wasn't mourning, it was resentment wrapped in confusion. She looked like someone who had lost control of a narrative she thought she owned. Stephanie stood beside her, holding the funeral program in both hands like a shield. She glanced at me, just once, quickly, then looked away. Her shoulders were rigid, her lips slightly parted. I could see the storm behind her eyes, the questions, the discomfort. She had lived her whole life believing her father belonged entirely to her, that his affections and his loyalties came with a bloodline. And now she had heard his voice name someone else as home. Her silence wasn't out of respect. It was the absence of understanding. A cousin I barely knew lingered by the back pew, his tie loosened, his phone in hand. He didn't meet my gaze. His eyes flitted to the floor, to the stained glass windows, anywhere but mine. He didn't know where to stand anymore. He had probably arrived that morning believing he understood the hierarchy of James's life. Now he stood unsure which story to follow. There was a woman near the back whom I didn't recognize. Someone who worked with James years ago, I guessed. Her face was soft, sad, but different. She looked at me the way one looks at something finally revealed. Not with pity, with clarity, and maybe even with quiet approval. The funeral director, who had never once spoken to me directly during the planning, now gave me a small, curt nod. I didn't return it. He was just another man who had followed the script handed to him by others, never questioning who was missing from the credits. Each face told a different story. Each face betrayed something they hadn't prepared for. Because James's letter hadn't been dramatic. It hadn't accused or blamed. It hadn't attacked or undermined. It had simply told the truth, plain, warm, undeniable. And sometimes the truth is more shattering than any confrontation. As I walked toward the doors, I caught a glimpse of our photo on the memory board, one of the few I had mailed years ago for their anniversary slideshow. They had included it, likely because they couldn't find many others. It was tucked between childhood shots of James with his siblings and a few grainy hospital staff group pictures. In it, we were sitting on a bench in Maine, the sea behind us, his hand over mine. We weren't posing, we weren't performing, just there, together. I wondered if they had looked at it that morning and seen it only as decoration. Now they had context. Now they had words to match the image. I reached the doors and paused. I turned once, not fully, just enough to scan the church one last time. Their faces were still there, still watching, still unsure. But I wasn't. I walked outside and let the cool air hit my face. James had given me something they could never take back: recognition. In his final hour, he had called me what I was, what I had always been: not second, not hidden, not tolerated, chosen. Their faces would fade, but his words wouldn't. The days after the funeral passed like fog, thick, silent, and unhurried. I didn't mark them with tasks or calendars. I didn't try to clean out closets or pack away memories. I let the days come as they were, muted and unapologetically quiet. But what stood out most wasn't the grief. It was the silence. No one called. Not Stephanie, not Lynn, not a cousin or a neighbor or anyone who had once sat beside me at holiday dinners or smiled at me in James's presence. The people who had filled the church with flowers and folded hands, who had shared childhood stories about James in eulogies they wrote without me, simply disappeared, as if the service had been a curtain call, and now that the show was over, the actors had left the stage. No messages, no voicemails, no notes in the mail. For the first few days, I checked my phone more than usual, not because I expected kindness, but because I expected consequence. Something, anything, even discomfort disguised as courtesy. But there was nothing, just spam calls and weather alerts. At first, I thought perhaps they were embarrassed, maybe too ashamed to reach out, unsure of what to say, now that James had shattered their carefully composed image of his life. But as time moved on, I realized the truth was simpler, easier. They had returned to the version of the world where I didn't exist. James's letter had been a rupture, but only a temporary one. It had disrupted their performance, forced a crack in the narrative. But as soon as it was over, they wrapped that crack in silence, pretended it hadn't happened, moved on. People do that. They rewrite reality not with words, but with absence. I stopped checking my phone. I stopped expecting knocks on the door or flowers on the step. Instead, I began relearning the shape of my house without James in it. I kept his mug in the cupboard. I still made tea for two out of habit. His slippers stayed under the bench, untouched. I let myself keep these things for no one's approval but my own. I didn't need to grieve loudly. I didn't need to perform loss for the world. I was allowed to carry it quietly, like a well-worn sweater. I remembered the last birthday I spent with James. His family hadn't called that day either. He made dinner reservations himself. We sat in a small Italian restaurant, the candles low, the waiter cheerful but not overbearing. I had given him a leather wallet with his initials stamped inside. He gave me a card with just one line inside: "You're the life I chose." I had tucked that card into the same drawer where I'd kept his letter. Now I opened that drawer often, not out of sadness, but as ritual. I would read both notes in the morning, sip my tea, and carry on with the day. It wasn't that they made me feel stronger. They just made me feel seen. Because the thing about being erased is that it's never about forgetting. It's about pretending someone never mattered. But James hadn't done that. He had left behind proof, undeniable, handwritten proof. So I let the silence stay. I didn't break it. I didn't chase them. I didn't try to be included again. There was a time in my life when I might have sent thank you cards, when I might have reached out just to be polite, to be proper. But I had grown out of that. Loss reshapes more than grief. It reshapes who you no longer have the energy to explain yourself to. I spent my days walking the neighborhood, tending the small herb garden James used to joke was my tiny kingdom, and reading books I had been meaning to get to for years. I let the world shrink in all the right ways, and still, no one called. But for once, it didn't feel like rejection. It felt like release. After the silence had settled and grown familiar, I began to turn my attention to what came next, not emotionally, not spiritually, but practically. There were decisions to be made, accounts to close, documents to review, a life to sort through piece by piece without ceremony or applause. James had always been organized. We kept a small lockbox in the closet with neatly labeled folders: insurance, deeds, retirement accounts, the will. Everything had been prepared. We used to joke that our paperwork was neater than our pantry. I opened the box one morning with quiet determination and brought the folders to the kitchen table. I didn't cry. I didn't hesitate. I simply began. The will was straightforward. He had left everything to me. There was no debate, no loophole, no vague wording that could be interpreted otherwise. It was notarized, witnessed, dated, and signed in his careful script. There was no mention of his children, no bequests to extended family, just me. I made an appointment with the estate attorney we had worked with for years. She was kind, direct, and slightly surprised by how calm I was. She asked if I anticipated any disputes. I told her no, because by then I knew that the family wouldn't come knocking. Not for answers, not for money, not even to contest. Their silence wasn't just social, it was legal. They had chosen to vanish. Still, I followed every protocol. I filed the necessary paperwork, notified the bank, transferred titles. I closed the joint accounts, moved the assets into my name, and created a new trust with only one beneficiary, myself. It wasn't out of spite, it was out of clarity. There were other things to clean up, too. Lingering subscriptions in his name, an old email account, a storage unit we hadn't used in years. I cleared it all. No emotion, no delay. I shredded what needed shredding and boxed what deserved preservation. A small photo album, his watch, a pair of cufflinks I had given him on our 10th anniversary. Everything else went. It was astonishing how much weight a life could carry in forgotten corners. I didn't keep things that didn't carry meaning. I didn't hold on to his childhood baseball glove or the trophies his family had once displayed proudly. I didn't save the holiday cards from relatives who hadn't called since the funeral. If it didn't speak to the life we had built together, the real life, the daily one, I let it go. I canceled the shared phone plan. I removed his name from the utilities. I changed the locks, not because I expected anyone to return, but because it was mine now. The house, the silence, the freedom. I also sat down and wrote my own will. I didn't have children, no siblings, no nieces or nephews I was particularly close to. So I made a list of friends, people who had stood by me quietly, the neighbor who brought me groceries during that first hard week, the librarian I'd worked with who still sent handwritten birthday cards. I included them. I gave clear instructions, no assumptions, no open ends. I donated to the hospice center where James had spent his final hours. I made a quiet gift to the local animal shelter, the one we used to walk past and joke about adopting every senior cat in. I didn't announce it. I didn't need their names carved anywhere. I just wanted the act to be clean, simple, whole. One afternoon, I found a dusty file at the back of the cabinet, an old family tree chart that Lynn had insisted James fill out years ago. His name branched outward to his parents, his children, his siblings. There was a line for spouse, and in faint pencil, my name had once been written there. It had been erased, not scratched out, just gently rubbed away, like a smudge someone hoped would be forgotten. I held the paper for a long moment. Then I folded it and dropped it into the bin, not in anger, in peace, because erasure only works if you let it. And I no longer did. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and watched the streetlights flicker on. I thought of James, of the quiet way he used to sit beside me, of the final gift he had left me. Not money, not property, not control, but clarity, a clean balance, no debts, no guilt, no unfinished business, just my name standing on its own, with nothing to prove. It took me 3 months to choose the headstone, not because I couldn't afford it or didn't know what I wanted, but because I needed time. Time to make sure that what I carved into the marble would remain long after the memories of the funeral faded, long after the silence from his family returned to indifference. I wasn't trying to leave a mark out of spite. I was building something that would last longer than anyone's narrative. The cemetery was quiet the day I returned. I parked beneath the willow tree James and I used to walk past when we visited other graves. He used to say he wanted something simple, no bronze statues, no elaborate engravings, just stone, sun, and his name. A quiet place. I walked the rows slowly, past strangers and names that no longer rang with living sound. I didn't carry flowers. I carried the final version of the inscription, printed neatly on a piece of thick cardstock. The letters were clear, bold, spaced just so. His name, the dates, and beneath them, one sentence, chosen carefully. Words that carried weight not just for me, but for anyone who ever stood in front of that stone and wondered who he was. Beloved husband of Linda, who held his hand when no one else saw. It was not poetry. It was not dramatic, but it was truth. And truth, when etched in stone, is stronger than silence. The stonecutter had called the week before to confirm the placement. He asked if I was sure I wanted my name on it already. I said yes, not because I was in a rush to join James beneath the soil, but because I wanted it known now. I wanted the world to see what they had tried to erase. I wanted the story to be whole while I was still alive to witness it. When I arrived that day, the stone had been set. There it was, granite, polished, unmoving. I stood there longer than I expected. The grass around the grave was still soft, not fully settled. The air was cold, not cruel. I let my fingers brush the edge of the stone, feeling the weight of those letters beneath my skin. It was done. They couldn't change it now. They couldn't argue with a voice that came from the grave and a stone that would stand long after we were all gone. They couldn't bury me in absence anymore. He had named me, and now the world would see it, even if they never came to visit. I wondered briefly if Lynn had been there, if Stephanie had come and seen those words, if they had felt the sting of being written out not by me, but by time. But I let the thought go. It didn't matter anymore. The story didn't belong to them. I walked around the cemetery one last time before heading back to the car. The wind was stronger than before, rustling the dried leaves, carrying them in short gusts between headstones. The sound was sharp but clean, like pages turning. In the trunk of the car, I had packed a picnic, just for myself. James and I used to bring sandwiches to the park near here. I spread out the blanket in the grass nearby, sat cross-legged, and ate slowly, turkey on rye, an apple, a thermos of tea. I wasn't mourning anymore. I was remembering, honoring, continuing. And I had done what I came to do, not to prove anything, but to write the ending myself. I looked back at the stone once more before I left. My name set in quiet confidence beneath his, not added later, not penciled in, not negotiable, permanent. The name on the marble was mine, and no one could chisel it away.